You are not going to believe what Vladimir Putin is up to try to incentivize women to have more kids in Russia to keep the entire country from imploding. Now, on this episode, Lust is Boring, we don't often have any economists come on. In fact, I don't think we've ever had any. But today we've got quite a treat. Catherine Pakaluk is an author, an economist, professor over at Catholic University, brilliant woman, and she's taken a look at what is going on in terms of this demographic winter that's taking place not only in communist nations, but developing countries all over the world. Why aren't people having kids, and why has this whole idea of reproductive freedom kind of backfired on a lot of these countries? In fact, I was in Des Moines, Iowa just this past week, and I was getting to the airport, and there was a huge billboard next to the airport, and it said, reproductive freedom is the key to healthy families. Today, we're going to look at, okay, how's that working for us on a global scale? Now, before we dive in, first, just want to thank everybody that supports us on Patreon. If you want to support this community and help us to grow with this mission, for the next 4 weeks, anybody who signs up for Patreon to support us, we will send you a free digital copy of any book that we have ever published. So you go to just patreon.com/Jason Evert, sign up for $10 and more per month to support the mission, and we'll send you whatever digital book you want that we have ever published. So patreon.com/Jason Evert. But stay tuned for this episode. I know you're going to enjoy it. Unfortunately, there is a bit of an echo on her side of the recording, so ask your forgiveness on that. But if you can bear with that echo, I think you're going to be rewarded by how rich this woman's content is. Enjoy. Catherine, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Absolutely. It's great.
No, it's awesome to have you on. You're our first economist we've ever had on the Lusty podcast, not our typically run-of-the-mill.
I'm honored. There's so much like economics in like all of the things that you guys talk about. So it's great.
No, it's true, but I don't think people put two and two together. Like, why is abstinence financially a smart decision? Why is cohabitation a bad idea? You run the numbers. It all kind of backs up the church teaching. So tell us how you got kind of involved in this area of expertise and church teaching.
Sure. Well, I really got into it because I was coming at this from a pro-life angle. So I grew up really pro-life, and I, as a college student, I thought, what can I do to help? What's and I started to talk to people, and I realized pretty quickly that basically economists didn't have good answers for whether or not we needed to kind of export birth control with huge financial incentives to help countries to grow. And so as a college student, somebody who's concerned about the pro-life movement, I thought, wait a second, could this possibly be true? Wait, is it possibly true that we need to sort of, really push abortion and birth control around the world in order to get economic growth? So that was the question I had. So I thought, well, I better go to grad school. I don't really know the answer. I thought it couldn't be the answer, but I didn't know why. So I said, sign me up. I want to know more about economics. At this point, I didn't really even know what economics was. And so ever since then, I've been studying kind of the relationship between population, demographics, and household decision-making. Mm-hmm. And so, this is the culmination of a lot of years of thinking about stuff.
It's a fascinating intersection of topics, because a lot of people think that solution to poverty is to reduce the number of innocent poor children, when in reality, the solution to poverty is to reduce the number of corrupt rich politicians. I mean, that's what needs to get switched around. But speaking of politics, I want to rant a little bit on Russia before we get rolling here. Just because, obviously their population is just it's going through a demographic winter like so many other nations are in the, especially in the western part of Europe. And so Russia's obviously concerned about this, because without people, you have no economy, you have no military, you have no country. And so they wanted to find some stuff to kind of kickstart their population. And if Putin ever watches this episode, which I don't think he will, I don't know that he subscribes to Lust is Boring, but I will probably go missing. One of my airplanes will just mysteriously crash somewhere in the Himalayas. But I just want to go through a little timeline. And for our listeners, I'm not making this up. You can go and look up all of this stuff. So in the early 2000s, he wanted to kind of kickstart population because he saw it plummeting. So he declared, and this is 2007, that September 12th would be a national holiday called the Day of Conception. And the idea was you can take the day off of work and just go home and go make a baby. And if your baby is born 9 months later, which just happens to be Russia Day, which is kind of like their 4th of July. So your baby's born on the holiday, you can win a refrigerator. You'll win a television. One couple even won an SUV. And so they thought this will really, get the ladies in the mood. Well, it didn't end up working. And so then 2008, Putin came out and he said, okay, well, let's give an honorary award to any families that have 7 or more kids. He said, you will get the Paternal Glory Award if you have 7 kids or more. Now, unfortunately, they were shocked that didn't work. The Parental Glory Award was not enough. The 2012 cash prizes if you have a kid. With this conception day landing on, you can win a cash prize, not just a TV. That didn't work. Now, 2013, this is when it gets really fun. Putin decided kind of take things up a notch a bit. And so knowing obviously what women are really looking for when it comes to romance, he hired Boys to Men to fly out to Moscow and have a concert just before Valentine's Day. Now, shockingly, Motown Philly, it wasn't able to do the trick. And so their population did not see a rebound after Boys to Men came there to the Kremlin. And so 2022, they decided to come up with a new award. This is great. To any woman who raises 10 or more kids, you get the following. Okay, now first is a disclaimer. All 10 have to be alive. If any of them have died, then they don't count as kids. Unless they died during military service, then they count. So if you've got like 2 boys who died invading the Ukraine, they still count as kids. But if you lost a 3-year-old to leukemia, that doesn't count. You need to have technically 11 to get the 10. Okay. So if you do though, you got 10 living kids and nobody died except those in military service, you moms who've had 10 kids will be honored with an honorary title of Mother Heroine. Okay, now this is a first title, first used by Joseph Stalin. So it's kind of like a nice nod there to a tyrannical dictator and genocidal person. And so not only do you get that title, which is just, I mean, that's really exciting. As my teenagers would say, that's gas. That's lit, that's chicken, that's really exciting. So you get called Mother Heroine. You get 1 million rubles, which is like $16,000. But I mean, as a father of 8 kids, that'll last you about a month at Costco.
Yeah, that's
got that many kids.
For 2 weeks.
So, but wait, there's more. There's more. You, Catherine, okay, just to get us 10 kids, you will get an award, which is a 5-pointed star surrounding the Russian state emblem. And you're going to be instructed to wear that on the left side of your chest. So you get to have a free emblem. Now, what's astonishing is that this actually didn't jumpstart the fertility rates. And so bringing it up to this very month. Okay, now we are in September 2024. This is literally 10 days ago. Vladimir Putin was speaking at the Eurasian Women's Forum promoting women in the workplace and an increase in the birth rate because he wants both. We got to have this economic productivity and we need lots of kids. And so he was encouraging women, look, have a bunch of babies and work all the time. So the Kremlin's top doctor, this is apparently Russia's health minister, Dr. Yevgeny Shestopolov. He was asked, the media asked this guy, when are women supposed to find the time to manage a family? Okay, legitimate question. Russia's health minister replied, being very busy at work is not a valid reason, but a lame excuse. And so a reporter asks back, there are people who work 12 to 14 hours a day. When do they make babies? Now, in accordance with the true spirit of Soviet communism, he answered, you can engage in procreation during breaks at work. Life flies by too quickly. So this is a whole new level of communist multitasking going on. And so now, Catherine, Vladimir Putin and I don't have an awful lot in common, but one thing we both have in common is that like we're not women, okay? We're not mind readers, okay? So like, what is it really going to take to get women feeling simultaneously patriotic and romantic? I mean, do we need to throw in a dishwasher? Do you need like maybe a timeshare in Moscow overlooking the Kremlin and Red Square? I mean, why is this not working, Catherine?
It's not working. I mean, I just think, there needs to be more trips to the salon, maybe some massage membership. I mean, those are the things that really matter to the ladies. Massage. No, this is so sad, right? And I can see how they're really stuck. I mean, one of the features of this, you see, seeing this around Europe is they can't really say what needs to be said, which is like, you can take time off of work. And why can't they say that? Well, because they don't have enough workers. They're already stuck in a place where there aren't enough workers, and they don't want to lose the women in the workplace, but they also need them to make babies. So I say this because it's like they really are in a place where there's no good solution. Why isn't it working? I think the obvious answer there is that they're not thinking about they're not thinking like women. But I mean, look at the costs of having that baby are many, and you've got to get people to like wake up 4 times a night, 6 sleepless nights. Your body is going to go through a lot of stuff. Then there's the question, of course, of like the long-term collision. Okay, you could go, sneak into the other office and make the baby at work, but you got to be pregnant for 9 months. And then, even if you're giving people 6, 8, 9 weeks off of work, so some kind of generous, like Putin maternity leave policy, you still have to come back to work at the end of that. And you've got this needy human being that actually most women would like to be in a relationship with. So then you're forecasting out. You're going to make all these babies, but you don't get to be with them. And that's really tough. So people don't talk very often about the hardship of leaving your kids behind and some kind of maybe some state-sponsored daycare. Maybe they're going to import, I don't know, immigrants to take care of these babies in daycare centers. I don't know. So obviously, I don't think they've got the details sketched out here. But basically, in a nutshell, what we think is happening is that women understand that there's a lot of costs to having children that are like not things you can easily incentivize. It's not going to be a few $1,000. My body's going to change. I'm not going to sleep. I'm going to feel torn between work and home. And I mean, there's kind of like not a dollar sign you can put on that, right?
Well, we can get an emblem. I mean,
we can get an emblem. We can get the gold star, like the 5-pointed star. I mean, this is kind of madness. I mean, right? And it's like what policymakers do everywhere. And kind of like you don't really think about the root of the problem. You just kind of think like, how do you throw money or prizes or awards at the problem? Yeah. But the root of the problem, of course, is something nobody really wants to look at here.
Yeah, it's almost, I mean, you're right that they're looking at it from a male perspective, because how much time technically needs to be spent on a man's behalf to create a human being?
Not that much.
Not a lot of time. And that's it. Okay, so all right, well, we just need to give you that time, and then we have a human being. And so now let's say Vladimir comes to his senses and he says, Catherine, I resign leadership of the Soviet Union and I'm going to give you the reins. Okay.
Wow.
What is the big
Catherine
picture?
the Great. I can take over. You Catherine the Great.
Yeah. And so what's the big cultural piece that's right in front of their face that they can't even see that needs to shift? I mean, the big picture. What is the big picture they're missing?
Yeah. So the big picture is kind of 2 pieces. I would I'll put it in 2 pieces. One is that people don't really need kids anymore. People don't need kids. Now that sounds like really super utilitarian, but actually we've come to grips with this as a reality. So countries need kids, right? Countries need kids. Obviously, this is what you're describing. We need kids. Everybody needs kids. But individuals who are making these decisions don't need kids. And what do I mean by that? I mean, well, there was a time when if you wanted to have a nice life, you'd have to have some minions around to like get the water, like milk cows and take care of the horses. I don't want to do all that by myself, right? So we can think about the agricultural times when farms and households would be much better off. Or even, we don't even have to have a farm in this picture. We could just be like, well, we don't have dishwashers and we have no kitchens really small to do the household chores. The bottom line is that thanks to sort of technological progress and economic growth, there's an awful lot of things that you don't need kids to do. Now, there's a couple of things we probably could have done on purpose to make kids less needed. So even if you say, oh, we've got an automatic cow milking machine, we don't need kids to milk the cows anymore. When I get old, like who's going to take care of me? Right. And that would be a very sustained and real reason that you might think like it would be a good idea to have, even if I didn't like kids. I'd be like, oh, yeah, it's kind of a good idea to have a few. But obviously enter like the early 1900s, we start to think about kind of collectivizing old age care. In other words, if you're not wealthy enough to save for your retirement, there's going to be a way for you. You could have no kids at all and still retire with some kind of basic income. That's what we have. So that's another thing we chipped away at. Then you've got to think about what we call the birth control revolution. So the pill comes along. And what does that do to household demand for children? Well, that's going to sound like really weird, but basically it means you don't have to be willing to accept children in order to be intimate. Now that deals a very large blow to sort of the thing we think about demand for children in the household. So like that's the big picture. Like little by like piece by piece, children go from being sort of an economic necessity for household to being, well, what's left over after all that? Just pure cost. It's pure cost. Meaning, it's going to cost you money, like you said, your Costco trips, it's going to cost. And then once you have the pill involved, you've got this really cheap, easy, convenient, reversible, fairly effective birth control. Well, a lot of women would like to split their time between some child raising and some work and some career. So this is another way in which households are choosing to do something that's other than raising children. So here's the problem. Basically, countries need kids. We all need kids for the country to keep going. But for each individual household, when you take all these pieces out, it's not really that rational to have more than a couple kids.
Yeah, so at the end of the day, the problem is that they really don't value the family as an entity. They see the family as a means to an end of economic stability and growth. It's like, we need you kids, not because you're valuable in and of yourself. We need you kids to keep the machine running. And the population problem is like a cog in the wheel of the communist machine that has a utilitarian value placed on the human person. And until that gets eradicated at the core level, you just can't, there's no solution.
Yeah, that's right. But if I could be so bold as to suggest, I think it's not just the communist countries, the communists. I mean, basically we're all facing a similar kind of problem. And when you strip away all of that economic logic, which I think is pretty precise, I guess I don't think, and I'm still struggling with this, but I don't really think that it's probably correct to say that in the last 1,000 years, people generally value children more for their own sakes than we do today. But there are a lot more very strong reasons why you might have more children. These kind of need questions. So most people do things either because they want to or because they need to. Need is a pretty strong reason. We've stripped away all the needs. So what's left is who wants to have children. So what we're seeing right in the West, in the countries that are not necessarily communist countries, is the only people left having kids are the people who have figured out a reason to value children for their own sakes. And by and large, this is people of faith.
Yeah, and I would imagine by and large it's the Muslims, at least when it comes to Western Europe, because you look at what's going on in France. And I remember speaking at a Catholic high school in England. Catholic high school was 95% Muslim because no one else was having kids. Usually before I give a chastity talk, I'll ask the campus minister, what percentage of the students here are Catholic versus non-Catholic, kind of a feel for where they're coming from. And I said, 95% of these kids are Muslim in the Catholic school because everybody else was just contracepting themselves out of existence.
Yeah, that's right. So, what we see is that with the Muslim populations, it's pretty stable around the world. A lot of times, the immigration is fueled by a kind of being at an earlier stage of economic development. But even in England, within typically 1 to 1.5 generations, the Muslim immigrants, their birth rates will go kind of closer to the native English population's birth rates. So they stand out to us because they're so unusual. There's so many of them and so different. But we actually don't think that even Muslims in general in places like France and England will manage to sustain those super high birth rates.
Wow. Now turning the table from these economic and military powerhouses like Russia or China, going to more third world developing nations, we were exporting all these contraceptives to, kind of promising them this is the remedy for poverty. If we can just give you fewer kids, you're going to have fewer expenses, and so you're going to have more disposable income, and you're going to be better off as a family. So here's your pill, here's your depot, let's tie your tubes, and you're going to be so much better. And so I think by the millions, people kind of bought these things. I mean, there's plenty of areas, thanks be to God, in Africa where they're like, no, like our children are our wealth. Like that is the treasure that we're going to have in this life. And you're not going to rob us of all that. But other people, you know, in other nations were like, oh, this is going to really help us out. But then at the end of the day, they have more contraception, but they don't have any more food on the table. Their income hasn't really gone up. Their population has just gone down. So how was this just a bill of goods sold to developing nations?
Yeah, it definitely was a bill of goods. I mean, China, like the best thing you can say for China with their one world policy, right? Which was, you could say, well, it was just China. Well, actually, the West, like a lot of academic elites in this country and certainly in Europe, really kind of encouraged and condoned this policy, right? So the bill of goods is that we sold was really obviously rotten, so it's obviously defective. You know, some economists who work in the same area that I work in use this language. Julian Simon has this language, like people are the ultimate resource. If you want to get kind of wealthy, you have to really think hard about protecting the resource for people. Definitely. People who worked on these kind of like exporting the contraception programs, and especially these were especially popular in the 70s, the 80s, into the 90s. They definitely were fueled by a sense that there were going to just be too many people in the world. And they were fundamentally wrong about that. So they were really fundamentally wrong about it. They definitely haven't owned up to it. So they've done like a double. They've done a double disservice to these countries. One is that, you know, they helped them to slow their population growth down in ways that are probably going to contribute to economic stagnation for them. But the other thing is, we, countries like the United States, we benefited from lots of foreign immigration to our labor force in that same time period. So we were simultaneously selling countries on these contraceptive packages to sort of help them grow, right? And receiving lots of their best workers, right? And you know, I'm not saying that was wrong, but we kind of did this thing which is kind of exploitative. So when we look back, we say, actually, the only reason our birth rate was not collapsing in those same periods of time, the 80s, the 90s, is because we were importing so many immigrants into our workforce. So it was kind of like a twofold thing. We convinced them that they should slow down their birth rates in order to grow. And meanwhile, we sort of encouraged and took a lot of their, you know, probably best workers into our labor force. So it's just like fundamentally like a kind of colonialization that kind of fits the bill of like some of these bad colonializations in history, where you like export stuff that's bad and you also like take valuable resources.
Could you expand a little bit in terms of the overpopulation myth? Because I think that one dies hard. And still there's so many people that were like, no, we're eventually going to run out of natural resources and gas and food. And there's just not enough space in the planet. People are going to start falling off. And I mean, it's surprising how many people still believe this. Like when I read once that everyone in the world can actually fit in Jacksonville, Florida. Everybody. You could fit everybody in Texas and there'd be more living space than they have in the Bronx right now. So could you maybe explain like why overpopulation is not the problem?
I just got back from Wyoming, and I'm just here to tell you, man, like, I think the whole population of the world could fit in Wyoming. I mean, there's not a lot there. There's definitely more animals than people, I think, in Wyoming. I mean, if anybody's watching and they want to go, you know, check out the data for themselves, a really great place to look at this is the population tab on a website called Our World in Data. It's just replete with tons and tons of great information. Lots of really nice charts that show the progress of the world population. And so kind of there's two parts to answer your question. One is really quickly, like where are we at? Oh, where we're at is like the global population is going to peak pretty soon and then it's going to fall and it will never return to that kind of a peak again. We think so we just crossed 8 billion. And right now people are debating whether we're going to hit 10 or 12. The projections used to be that we'd hit a much bigger number. But now, like every year with these declining birth rates, they're declining faster than people expected. So right now, you know, people are like, well, we're never going to hit 12 billion, maybe 10 or 11. So they keep bringing the peak population closer and closer to us. And so the first thing is, as a matter of statistical fact, there's no projection out there which says that the world's population is going to keep rising. Just so people won't fall off the earth. It will not happen. The second question, which is probably more interesting, is why is that the case? And that is the case because as far as we can see, in all of the history of kind of tracking birth rates, what we see is that as countries have gotten richer and richer, their birth rates have gotten slower and slower, smaller and smaller. And so kind of we have this kind of paradox, actually, which is the more we can afford children, the fewer children we tend to have. So that's the dynamic at play. It's clearly not. It's clearly universal. It's happening everywhere. You mentioned Africa. There's a couple of tiny places in Africa where there are still populations of people who truly value children for their own sake. Most notably Nigeria. It's a very, very Catholic country. It's very charming. You look at their, and they still really think, if you get 10 kids, you're super rich. Like that makes you rich. It's awesome. But we are seeing that even in places that 10 or 15 years ago, you would have said that, 6 or 7 kids is still pretty common there. Oh, it's coming way down. So now it's like, 3 or 4 kids. And I would say in the next 10 years, we'll see that most of Africa will have probably below replacement birth rate, just like the rest of the world. There's no place else that we're looking at as like, over there, we're going to get it straight. So there's no overpopulation. And what we're going to see soon is actually shrinking population for the whole globe. After we hit the peak, we will start to shrink. And we're already seeing that in many countries. So China shrunk last year. And I think now we're looking at a couple of years of shrinking population in China. Many other countries. Japan started shrinking 15 years ago. And so one by one, every country will get to that point where it starts to shrink.
Now, it's interesting how you mentioned that the more economic growth a culture sees, their population tends to decline. Do you think that's because people just get materialistic and they see children as a threat to their wealth? Like the more kids I have, this money is really nice to have. And if I have more of you little minions running around, I'm going to have less for me. Is that what's really at the core, a materialism over family values?
Yeah, so I don't think so. I actually think that part of it is just part of it's good news. Part of it is people, when you're really poor, more hands on deck is helpful. And it's kind of this idea that we talked about before. I don't think that we can say that in the past, people were less materialistic. I actually think like sin is sin, and people have always been, you can find materialism in a lot of places. But I do think that what you have to see when people get wealthier is that they sort of have more options. We see this especially with women's education. So as countries get wealthier, you educate your kids, right? So we know, like, go back 200 years ago, we weren't educating the kids that much. We said, really, look, as soon as you can carry a shovel, you're going to be out in the garden shoveling or whatever you're doing. So as we got wealthier, it was like, well, we can actually take a bunch of people out of the workforce, reserve them from entering the workforce, and put them in school. Well, who are those people? It's like all the teenagers. Teenagers 100% used to be working. So this is, I just want to like, this is not the only thing happening, but just to identify this kind of wealth effect. You get richer and you go, we don't have to have grandma working anymore. Like, why? I know, why is grandma working? Why is grandpa working? Let's give him a break. Why is my 12-year-old working? Well, what you do then is you put the boys in school, then put the girls in school. And then when girls go to school, they naturally want to do stuff with their education. And that creates a tension between two things that girls want to do. So we see that as girls' education rises, they tend to pursue other things as well. It's not that they don't want families, but they tend to split their time. They say, like, I like a family and I pick a career too. And, when people take a fixed number of years that you could be fertile and you divide that number of years between now having babies and something else you could do, you're just going to get fewer babies. So this is really robust. It happens everywhere. So much so that people will even say things like women's education is the best form of birth control. That's a thing you hear.
Wow, interesting. Because the average age, what I read is the average age that a woman marries in America right now is about 30.
It's about 30.
The latest it's ever been. And this is the first time in American culture where the majority of Americans are not married. That's never happened before. But then what's the answer? Like, why have kids? Like, what is the compelling reason that can actually shift this problem? Like, what is the answer? Why have them? Not just have an extra set of hands on the farm. Why should we have them?
Exactly right. So if you don't need to have kids, then what would make you want to have children? It's kind of what you're saying. And I went around and talked to a bunch of people who are still having kids. And, I was hearing something that sounds super old fashioned, but really quite compelling, I think, which is just, actually children are blessings from God, and they're the purpose of your marriage. They cement your marriage. They are what you're called to be as a couple. Children are light to the world. They're expressions of divine goodness. So I discovered that, these are motives to have children that are still operating today all over the country. There's all kinds of places. It's definitely minority, as we just described, right? The birth rates are falling. But if you go talk to, Mormon women, Catholic women, a lot of evangelical women, Jewish women, not just, and I don't mean all members of these particular churches, but, if you kind of dig around and go like, are there people out there in these churches who are still having kids? This is what they're going to tell you. They're going to say, well, actually, I think children are the greatest blessing. You go, oh, that sounds pretty biblical to me. You find out these are people who go to church a lot. The people who go to church, maybe not just on Sunday, maybe a couple extra times per week. And that would be true for the Catholics, also true for Mormons, true for the Jews. Like, these are people who live their lives centered around a church community. Okay, so then when you say, well, what can we do? Well, that's what we want to do. We want to sort of lean into the importance of religion in our lives.
So essentially, evangelization is the only answer to the underpopulation problem.
Yeah, that's actually what it looks like to me. I mean, right? I was talking with a reporter at NPR a couple weeks ago, and she said, well, like, isn't there any other way? Is there any other way? I'd really like there to be another way. And I said, I don't see one.
VCR.
I don't see one. I mean, we shouldn't really wish to be, we shouldn't whip or try to push society back to a place of, kind of more poverty, right? Where kids would be needed again in that respect. That's not a policy solution anyway. That's not something we would expect, Putin to be like, let's make us all poor again. I mean, so there's that. I mean, certainly, I'm just hazarding a guess here, but I don't know that anybody's tried it. Certainly, if we had less of a generous kind of old age program, it might I don't know. Let me think. Like in 30 years, you might see more kids because people are thinking, well, maybe like might have. But I mean, when I just getting that out of my mouth, it sounds absurd, right? If I'm going to say to you, look, I think old age programs and Social Security are working against the birth rate. Like, it almost sounds absurd to say, well, let's dismantle Social Security. It may run out of money anyway. I don't see any policymakers saying, I've got a plan for the birth rate. Let's trash Social Security. But listen, here's something that's sitting right in front of us, which is, it looks like it's perfectly compatible with modern life. Like Exhibit A, right over here. Maybe you're Exhibit B or vice versa. It's perfectly compatible with modern life to have become convinced that children are a great blessing. And that it's possible to organize your life around that. Okay. So like if we looked around the world and said, where is one place where birth rates are still at a healthy level above replacement? Well, actually, modern Israel is the place where birth rates are above replacement. So what does that mean? Well, it means if you have a larger percentage of really religious people, you can sustain a higher birth rate. Israel is not uniformly religious. They have a divided society between secular Israelis and more religious Israelis. That could be something that we would see in our future if Christians evangelize more. So
now, in the event China or Western Europe or Russia doesn't go with this, where does this lead? When all their efforts fail and yet they're unwilling to recognize the essential good of the family and the child. Where is this going to be 10, 15, 20 years from now? Is there going to be some economic implosion? Like, what happens when there's no Social Security to pay for the people? Like, what's going to happen here?
Well, I think it's all dark. I mean, I think the different scenarios we can come up with are pretty dark. We don't have a lot of historical examples. So I do want to say that, most of us projecting this are speculating. One thing to think about would be like, think of your favorite kind of Rust Belt town, a place that you have visited that like used to be really populated 70 years ago, but today, people grow up and move away. And that's kind of what it looks like. And when you go through those places and you see like that, I don't know, that like fast food joint that has the sign is turned around inside out, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
You're like, oh, that was a place, but now it's not a place anymore. That's kind of a picture of it, because when you have a shrinking population, you can't staff all the businesses that you'd like to staff. So you have to things have to start to close. So in the first pass at it, you say, well, what do you have? You basically have a country where increasingly things close. And the first things to close are going to be things that really contribute nearly to, mostly to quality of life. So fast food places, restaurants, other kinds of services that we've come to value. And maybe that doesn't sound that dire to some people, but what that will end up doing is we'll begin to see a stagnation and even eventually a contraction in economic growth. You mentioned something else, all of these old people retiring. Another dark feature of this, which I think unfortunately already starting to see, I think Canada would be a great example, is an incentive, a moderate to great incentive to come up with ways to reduce the financial burden of taking care of our elderly populations. Right? So Canada's is put in place a program, medically assisted aid in dying, medical aid in dying, MAID, MAID. And, I would like to believe, maybe I wouldn't, I would like to believe that these are people who's sitting around without, like a full conception of the dignity of suffering, who just think I want to alleviate suffering. And that would be maybe misguided. We would say, like, okay, look, we don't eliminate suffering by eliminating a person. It's like, that is not the way to do this. We suffer with people. This is the Christian approach. The dignity, the approach with respect and dignity. But here's the thing. I would like to think it was just an issue of reducing suffering, but it's obviously in the economic interest of the country of Canada to reduce the bill that's due for paying for the retirement medical care of its older population. I do think we're going to see that more and more. Kind of pressure to reduce those expenses. So, slower economic growth to the point of contraction of economic growth. An incentive to essentially mistreat our older population. None of that sounds terribly savory. And then the third thing would be kind of like, if you could imagine this, we're going to have all these countries that don't have enough workers. And so there is going to probably be a kind of a weird situation where countries will have to be, in a sense, trying to bid for the few immigrants that are left. And that's going to look really dark and strange. Some dystopian movie that I haven't seen.
Wow. I mean, just imagine that, right? Bidding for immigrants to keep yourself in existence.
Yep.
Hard to know. Now, I know you've written extensively on this subject. Where can people get a hold of your latest works and learn more about the stuff that you're doing?
Yeah, sure. So I just finished a book called Hannah's Children. And it's a survey where I travel around the country and talk to women who are having children. In spite of all of this sort of economic logic that goes against having kids, I talk to women of a lot of different faiths and put their stories together. And that book is it's available on Amazon. The New Yorker magazine has recently called it a cult classic. So I've reached new status.
You're a cult leader.
I know. I said, well, which cults? Which cults have called me in class? Like, I'm not really sure. But it's as close as a book that a social science book can read to be, like fiction. The women all have fake names, although they're real people. So that's probably the best example. I have a website, and I'm on Twitter, and every now and then I manage to squeak out interviews and other articles. But
what's the website so people can connect with you there?
Sure, it's my full name. I assume it's somewhere on the screen, but Catherine.Pakaluk.com. Catherine.Pakaluk.com.
Can you spell Pakaluk for those that are listening?
Pakaluk. P as in Peter. A-K-A-L-U-K. And if you're still not sure how to find me, you can find me on the Catholic University's website, of course. But if you Google me, I come up pretty quickly. Most of it's good. Not all of it. Most of it's good. Yeah. I mean, it's really a subject of a lot of interest for people right now. Because maybe we didn't spell it out perfectly in our last few minutes together, but in the last couple of years, lots of countries are seeing this kind of accelerated effect of the decrease of birth rate. So right now, this is a very timely discussion that basically, people they're all wringing their hands. So Putin is not the only one.
Yeah.
And we are probably about to see a lot of countries get a little bit bossy about how to encourage women to have more babies. I just think they're going to be barking up the wrong tree most of the time.
Now, isn't there another one? Is it El Salvador, or there's some leader down there that's really...
Oh, yeah. That's right. El Salvador has, what is his name? Bukele, I think. He's definitely kind of a strongman leader. It seems like some of the things he's done seems pretty good, but other things are a little bit dicey. Yeah. He might get really bossy about this. Hungary has been, notably very, I like bossy is the best word I can use. I mean, what I mean is these are countries that like laudably, they're not like the old China. They're not trying to minimize births. They want to promote, family births. I mean, obviously, we all agree, like, it would be good if there's more kids. But these like the things they come up with are really silly and they're not working. It's good to notice too that it's the things that like your timeline with Putin, I think is really great. Super instructive. He's been around long enough that we can be like, look at him. He's been doing this for all these years. So you have these new leaders coming into office. Even look, this has been a little bit part of this political cycle too right now that we're in. This is being recorded in the fall of 2024, and it's already been something that's been put to J.D. Vance as a vice presidential candidate. Like, what can we do to help the family? So everybody wants to know. Basically, everybody really wants to know, like, what's the solution? Like, is it too expensive to have kids or whatever? So I think it's really incumbent upon us to try to figure out the roots of the problem, and really, so this idea that basically evangelization is the answer. I want to be really clear. I don't mean that the politicians should become more religious. It'd be great if they did. I don't mean like policy has to become more religious, or the state has become more religious. But what it means is we actually have to see churches and church communities, places where you go to worship, where I go to worship. The state and the policymakers have to see those places as kind of the lifeblood of the country. Mm-hmm. Right? And so, from my perspective, I won't put words in anybody else's mouth, but from my perspective, when we had this, crisis of COVID, we viewed churches not as our lifeblood. We viewed them as like unnecessary things that we could. So, right, the liquor stores are going to stay open, but not the churches. Right? So that's just like an emblem of, I think, how we tend to treat churches, which is like they're kind of superfluous.
Yeah. And even within the church, there's the saying, if the church isn't crying, it's dying. Meaning, you're not hearing a bunch of babies cry in a particular church. It's like, good luck.
That's right.
It's such a sign of life. And when they're not there, who knows what's going to happen.
That's right. So like, as a simple concept would be like saying, well, it would be great if when Trump or J.D. Vance want to, I mean, we've just come out of this statement. Trump was like, well, we want more babies. We're going to do more IVF, right? You're like, oh, that's not really, I know you've covered that and other people covering that. It would be great if they could say, well, we'd really like to have more babies. So how can we treat our churches better? Right? So it's kind of like your religion policy is your family policy, actually. That's kind of like a conceptual way to think about it. How are you treating your churches? Are you favoring them? Are you protecting them? Are you protecting their status? Are you making it hard for them to do the charitable things that they would like to do? We've seen how a lot of really faithful religious social services, like adoption agencies, we've been making it very hard for them to do the kinds of things they'd like to do. In some cases, shutting them down. We think they're bigoted, whatever that looks like. So, I'm kind of just saying, like, I don't see a lot of else on the horizon that could be useful besides really having a kind of frank conversation about the value of religion in society. And like you said, if you're not crying or dying, which religions in particular, we don't have to look that hard. Just look around. Like everybody in their own place where they are, they know which churches are the ones where all the families live. I don't even have to fill in the blanks. Whatever state you're in, whatever. You go ahead.
Yeah, no. When I talk to people on the subject, they think of separation of church and state as the state needs to be protected from the church, when in reality it's the opposite. That was instituted to protect the churches from the state, not vice versa. And so long as the state sees the church as a threat to its autonomy and existence, good luck with the future where that's going to go, because the family so goes the culture.
And I would want to make just a sort of a small observation, which is that as I've mentioned before, it's not just all churches where you have this like wealth of children coming up. It's churches that hold specific beliefs about children and the meaning of sexuality and the meaning of marriage. Right. So those church communities that really that really convicted of that, and they really managed to pass that on to their members, that's where you're going to see the birth. Different churches have different languages for this, so we largely see this among Orthodox and Hasidic Jews, for instance. And their thought there is like, well, God said be fruitful and multiply. And God said children are your greatest blessing. And I believe that. So how would I live my marriage if I believe that? Right. So it's like very beautiful, very simple. Certainly we can think about the different Christian churches and what that looks like in the Catholic Church. very clear, right? Some churches, some pastors are passing on the sense that like you don't get married and wait to have your kids. The purpose of your marriage is to have your kids, right? That's like the whole purpose. And yet I do as a teacher of college students, I hear it all the time that, you get married, like have your time. You wait,
No.
Right? So this is probably a good opportunity for churches to kind of talk a little bit more about this. And I think what I'm kind of getting at in the Catholic Church, actually, but I think this is useful for other churches, is this idea that it's not really sufficient just to talk about ways that you can prevent births, right? Because in the Catholic Church, we're like, well, we can't do it this way, but you could do it this way, right? And I'm not here to say it would be wrong to do it that way, or that natural family planning, maybe it's Catholic birth control. Like, I actually just don't think that. I don't think that's true at all. But just to paint the picture, the real conversation is, well, why would you want to prevent the birth? Because that's how you would do it. Just why would you want to? Because this is like, well, and this is the greatest blessing God can send your marriage. And I think that's been maybe missed a little bit in the last couple of decades. I think we've been a little bit maybe overeager to sell all the mechanics of how to prevent births in the right way, in the godly way, rather than, what a blessing children are.
Yeah, but sometimes responsible family planning is having more kids, not less. That didn't even dawn on people that's the case. And we think this is such a complex question, but it's the first thing God ever asked us to do. Like, be fruitful. It's the first, and if we can't handle the first commandment, we shouldn't be surprised when everything else is kind of falling apart.
Right. And think about how instructive that would be, for all these, the ways in which we abuse the sexual faculty. We think that sex has these other purposes, and get really distracted, and we get like down these rabbit holes of, it would be very instructive if we kind of, began to remember, like, this is the meaning of this gift. Like, this is the meaning of this gift. So I talked to a pastor, or actually he came and talked to me after he heard me talk about the research of the book, and he said, I feel somewhat convicted by your message. And I said, well, like, how so? And he was a younger pastor, somebody who clearly, he'd come up in my generation. He said, well, I feel like I've been a very courageous pastor. I've preached against all the things that are kind of the hot button issues. I haven't shied away from them. I've talked about gay marriage. I've talked about this. I've talked about that. And I've been brave. And he said, but I've even preached about birth control. He said, but I don't think I preached specifically on the blessing of children. And I thought, oh, that's so interesting. That really helps me frame what it is that I'm trying to say here, right? Which is like, there's this positive, like the teachings on birth control are in service of a bigger reality. And that bigger reality is meant to be the motive, right? Not just like a can't, but what's it for?
Yeah, I remember there was an evangelical book that came out years ago called, I think, Heaven is for Real. And it was a story, apparently a true story about some boy who passes away and then is revived seconds later, minutes later. And he has this vision of what it's like in heaven. And it's remarkable, apparently, in the details where he tells his mom and dad, like, oh, like, you didn't tell me I had a sister. I saw her in heaven and she was this old.
Wow.
And the parents are like, whoa, that's the year we had the miscarriage, and that daughter would have been this age. And then he was describing his grandparents in heaven and just stuff the parents were like, whoa. And then he said to the dad, he said, yeah, Dad, Jesus really likes children. And the dad's like, I know, doesn't he though? And the kid's like, no, Dad, you don't understand. Jesus really loves children. And the dad's like, oh, I know. And the kid's like, no, Dad, I don't think you know. Jesus really loves the children. And the dad just kind of fell silent because he didn't quite know how much Jesus loved the children. I think until we get to that point of appreciation, civilization itself is doomed. But Catherine, it has been a joy to have you on the show. You are a true heroine. If I could give you an emblem for the work that you're doing, I absolutely would.
I want the heroine, national heroine star.
Mail you one out. But God bless you and keep up the wonderful work. Thank you for coming on.
Yeah, you're welcome. God bless.
Thank you. All righty. So that's a wrap. I'll just finish.